welcome to the Center of Architecture and Urban Planning, or so-called CAMP, that is part of the Institute of Planning and Development of the city of Prague. Good afternoon to the US, actually where you are in this moment.
I am in New York City. Good morning.
In New York City, okay. So good afternoon to New York City. And in the same time, good evening to our listeners and our audience here in Prague or online. Our talk today is part of the Urban Talks lecture series with international architects, designers, or interdisciplinary experts on urban planning. I'm Osamu Okamura, an architect, educator, and currently also a dean of the Faculty of Arts and Architecture at the Technical University in Liberec, and I will be your host today. Tonight we will speak about how to foster equitable cities and how to plan for a greater spatial justice. Why is a spatial justice a problem? Do we have a problem with the deficit of social justice in our country, in the Czech Republic? When looking at the United Nations annual World Happiness Report, Czech Republic is ranking the 19th position globally, just one place behind the US or two places behind the Germany. But are we all happy? Or is the happiness equally distributed? While some cities, neighborhoods, or communities are striving and growing, some other cities are struggling and shrinking. In the European Union, in general, more than half of the cities are shrinking. In the region of Central and Eastern Europe, it's more than 80%. Out of the 25 largest Czech cities, 13 are facing a population decrease in the last year. The smallest Czech town has just 73 inhabitants. While in the tiny municipalities of up to 1,000 inhabitants, we can find 1/3 of the approximately 650,000 vacant apartments in our country, in bigger cities, the housing is far from accessible. There are more than 127,000 people living on the poverty line in our country, in more than 830 socially excluded localities, in virtually all our cities. And this number is steadily growing. Now, I have a great pleasure to introduce Professor Toni L. Griffin, leading expert in planning for justice. Toni grew up in Chicago. That's a place where I actually spent a few months 2 years ago. As a graduate of Notre Dame, practiced architecture and gradually moved into urban planning and design over a 10-year career in SOM, a Chicago office. After a lab fellowship in urban planning and design at Harvard, she held a series of urban planning and design positions on the East Coast as a vice president of planning for the Upper Manhattan Developing Zone, deputy director of the DC Office of Planning, and director of community development for the city of Newark, New Jersey. Toni began teaching at Harvard's Graduate School of Design in 2006. From 2011 to 2016, she taught at the City College of New York, where she was the first director of the J. Max Bond Center for Design and the Just City. Now back at the Harvard, she has founded the Just Lab. Her exhibitions and publications include Design and the Just City, which was on display at the New York Center for Architecture, or the Urban Disobedience 99 Provocations to Disrupt Injustice in St. Louis. Griffin's professional practice and consultancy includes work from the city of Detroit for the city of Detroit that culminated in a comprehensive citywide plan, so-called Detroit Future City Strategic Framework. If you would like to name Toni's two most important innovations in urban planning, it would be the Just City Index and the pattern language. And we will come back to these for sure in our discussion right after the lecture. Here, I would like to invite our audience to vote also for your personal preferences when speaking about the values they want to keep or preserve or develop in their cities. The question you can find at the slido.com are prepared by Professor Griffin. And the question is, what 3 values are the most important to achieving a more just city where you live? In between these values, you can easily find acceptance, aspiration, democracy, engagement, identity, fairness, mobility, power, rights, or resilience. And also send us your questions via slido.com, slido.com, under hashtag Campuj online, Campuj online. So Toni, floor is yours. Screen is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually and to be in you all's homes and spaces this evening. I'm really delighted, and thank you for that extremely generous introduction. I feel like you've created a really great roadmap for how I'm going to share a few slides with you so we can quickly go into Q&A before our hour ends. So let me dive right in.
Thank you.
So I love that you started my intro by noting that I am from Chicago. And so this is my first grade class photo, and I am there. And the importance of why I want to start here is because I think I know now that I come to the work that I've been able to create through the way that I have reconciled my identity with the way in which I view cities and the world and design, and I have therefore found it necessary to address conditions that I feel like we as designers or planners are now called to do. And that really generous introduction and the question that we've given you all in the poll is likely because we're all sitting here because issues of justice, equality, and equity are forefront on our minds. So as you can see, most of the kids in the class look like me, and this is representative of the fact that Chicago, like a lot of US cities, are really very deeply divided by race. And so for the case of Chicago, most African Americans live on the south side of the city. Most white Americans live on the north, a lot of which are ethnic whites from your part of the world. In particular, really high concentrations of folks from Eastern Europe and Europe more broadly live on the north side. So my whole world was Black, if you will, and that felt completely normal to me until I decided I wanted to be an architect. And so in choosing to go to the University of Notre Dame, I found myself in a context that was the exact opposite of that. I was one of 3 African-American students in a class of 47. And during this time when I was in school, I was also one of the few women. Men greatly outnumbered the number of people in the profession. That's now quite the opposite today. Most architecture and planning programs are about 50-50. But not so much in terms of people of color. So in the United States, there are about 116,000 licensed architects. There's still less than 2% that are African-American, less than 4% that are Latinx. And I am one of only 500 African-American women who've ever gotten a professional license in architecture in the United States. And there I am, we in the shadows. This continues to be my existence in the profession. This is a photo from me at the University of Virginia after a Mayor's Institute of City Design, of which my colleagues, and most of the time I remain in spaces where most of the professionals that I'm seated around do not look like me. So obviously the way in which I am situated in the profession colors the way I think about it. But I've later come now to ask myself the question, well, why do cities look the way they do? And then what is our role as designers and planners in shaping that? So, as was said, I started my career at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in the Chicago office, and most of the architecture I produced there was a fairly large scale and commercial. This is the Broadgate development over Liverpool Street Station and Exchange House. I predominantly worked with the architect Bruce Graham while I was at SOM, but I also had the opportunity to transition while there at the practice from architecture to urban design and planning. And there I became really much more fascinated and excited about working on larger spaces of the city, because in doing so, I'm working with a much more diverse client group. Here, I'm working with a developer. When I'm working in urban design and planning, I'm working with civic leaders, elected officials, community members, organizations, everyday people. And that collaboration, plus the scale of the city, became much more aligned with what I didn't know at the time was a real interest that I had in cities. I then went on to transition from being an architect in private practice to working on the government side. And one of my first real public jobs was as deputy planning director in the DC Office of Planning, where we had the opportunity to grow that office from only 3 professional planners to about 60. And in doing so, we're able to take up doing very proactive planning for just about every part of the city, our neighborhoods, our commercial corridors, our waterfronts, our downtown. And to do that in such a way that we created a planning format that we were doing that collaboratively with community organizations, with residents, with institutions, with businesses, that allowed us, I think, to see the DC that we see now 20 years later after doing this really proactive and mission-driven planning work. It was important, we thought, to create a vision for what the city and what parts of the city needed to look like in order to help steward the type of investment and redevelopment and economic growth that cities needed, as opposed to chasing behind how markets were driving the economy and simply issuing incentives. In doing that, however, what I began to realize even more acutely than I was beginning to realize when I was an architect was this question of, well, why is this unequal? Why am I finding certain conditions in one part of the city and others in another? Why am I seeing a rapid amount of robust investment happening in certain parts of the city and not in others? So these are maps of Washington, D.C., which begins to look at the spatialization of inequality and disparity. So when we look at unemployment, poverty, education, where lower income housing and poorer residents live versus where wealthier residents live and more expensive housing, and even looking at the distribution of race. The blue dots on the map on the far right are African-American population. The red dots are white population, and that white space in the middle is the Potomac River and Rock Creek Park. And on the black and white images in particular, the darker the color, the worse the condition. So you can begin to see how all of the bad indicators of quality of life happen to be in the same space where the concentration of African Americans live in Washington, D.C. It was important to me at this time in realizing this, that this was not just unequal, it was unjust. And so I began to be much more focused on what would it mean to center issues of injustice and justice at the center of our work versus simply inequality. Because inequality to me certainly deals with the disparity we have, but justice to me deals with righting a wrong. And this is now all on top of these spaces of inequality and injustice are now the context for a whole other set of conditions of contest and trauma that we're waking up to the news every day. And as I'm sure you're hearing about what's going on here in US cities as well, everything from mass shootings to protests, to struggles over identity of whiteness versus blackness, to who belongs in our cities, who belongs in public space. Who's deciding what happens to women's bodies? Who's deciding what happens to our LGBTQ community and where they have rights and where they don't? What does it look like to stand up for something you believe in that has been deeply embedded in the ideals of American society and democracy, but haven't really been fulfilled for everybody? All of these are happening in the spaces we design in cities. So what is then the intersection between our role and what we do and how we take on dealing with these larger societal, economic, environmental issues? So as was said, I was able to, my first opportunity to kind of step back from practice and teaching and reflect upon this question, what is the way in which design and planning takes on issues of social and spatial injustice, is by creating this research platform, which has now become the Just City Lab. In the lab, and over the course of the last 8 years, we've been able to do a number of things that allow us to investigate and question this notion, all with the reality of maybe we would come back with answers that say, maybe design doesn't do that much, or here's where design can actually lean in a little bit more. We believe, and we've begun to define our sort of notion of the just city is where people in communities, but especially the least not included, have access to the networks and environments that allow them to have the most opportunities and resources to be productive and prosperous while advancing their social, economic mobility and agency. Now, while we've created this definition, we do not believe that the just city looks and performs the same everywhere. A just Prague is going to be very different from a just Chicago, than a just New Orleans, than a just Johannesburg, than a just Medellin. And while there may be similarities, and I think you saw some of those if you've had an opportunity to read any of the essays in the Just City essays, which have been written by 26 different practitioners from around the world, there can be some similarities, but our political and cultural contexts are quite different. And therefore, that should be informing what a just Prague might mean versus what a just Chicago or New York might mean. So we've had the great fortune to use different platforms to explore this question, whether it's through doing data-driven research to look at some of our post-industrial cities and see where the trends of unjust practice and inequality still reside, looking at where inclusion exists in the field of architecture, whether it's in the academy or in practice, developing a set of indicators and metrics for how we might value social justice within the public realm of New York City's plazas. The essays that I just talked about, using my design studios at the GSD to use values and then overlay those values onto the solutions that designers might use to address conditions of injustice. And just recently, we convened about 46 different practitioners to have a closed-door conversation about how we're defining justice and for who. We've had the opportunity to, over the last 4 years, begin to build a catalog of case studies of design projects. And in working through interviews with designers, asking them about what are the conditions of injustice that were embedded in the project. Were there a set of values that they aim to address through their design solutions, and to look for the way in which they developed design strategies to address those conditions. We've had the opportunity to mount 2 exhibitions that explore this. One included a set of interviews with different types of design practitioners. The gentleman you're looking at here is a graphic designer who's done the cover art for Chance the Rapper. The guy in the background is a journalist and publishes a design publication in South Africa, asking them about how conditions of injustice show up for them personally and how they show up in their art. In New York, we created a wall of a map of New York. And similar to what we're doing with you through the poll, asking folks to take value stickers and place the value that shows up in one of their favorite places in the city. So at the end, we have this map of where certain values were in different parts of the city. The index, as I said, is something we created because we have found that terms like equity, resiliency, and sustainability have become so ubiquitous and vanilla that they don't mean anything anymore. And that, in fact, there's a much richer vocabulary of values that we might combine that begin to describe more authentically the aspirations we have, for example, for Prague as a city or for different neighborhoods in Prague. And we should talk about with CAMP maybe a way that CAMP can translate this into your language and such that you all can use it more robustly. And what's been great is we've been able to use this through a series of different workshops and master classes that allow us to experiment with, is this a useful tool to allow us to work with people that are different from ourselves and to find common ground through values. So these are images from a workshop we did in Johannesburg with the Wits Center Academy at the University of Joburg, that we're looking at different neighborhoods around a transit-oriented development framework and asking those different participants to use the index to set forward an aspiration for what they wanted to see, but then to go and look at the neighborhood and identify where conditions of injustice were, and then begin to brainstorm solutions for combating those. We've done convenings at conferences, allowing people to create what we call the Just City Manifesto, which walks through a series of prompts so that you, whether it's your organization, whether it's a business, whether it's a community of neighborhoods, whether it's civic leaders, can design your own convening that can use these tools to create your own aspiration for more just outcomes. And I should say all of these tools are available on our website that you can download and use for free. And just like we're doing today, for some of the conferences we've done, we've collected the inputs and created these summaries of what some of the findings were. And we do this to validate the point that the ways in which different combinations of people in different parts of the world have different both issues of injustice that are important to them and values that they prioritize. So you'll see this conference of aging on the left. Housing was the most important injustice that they wanted to see, and values related to mobility and welfare were more critical. Whereas when we did this with a group of young Black designers, issues of economic injustice were more important, and power was the most important value. So we firmly believe the tool allows people to access the values and conditions that are unique to place, and therefore get to a more authentic aspiration and vision for a future for that place. So we've had the opportunity to do this in a number of different places since 2008. And so now we get to update this and add you all to the map. And again, we encourage people, and all of our tools are available online for free. And so you don't have to do this work with us. We encourage you to take it, adapt it, and incorporate it into the work that you do at any scale. So lastly, I just want to talk and show you a couple examples from how I push this work out of the academy and into my practice, Urban American City. Having the opportunity to think this through in the academy and pushing real world problems into the research lab as a way to test these models, I've come up with a notion for our practice, which is rooted around something I call just urbanism, which I think has to be both restorative and disruptive. Restoring for the unjust practices and inequalities we find in our cities, some of those put in place through public policy. So we have to be really bold and disruptive to dismantle those systemic ways that injustice and racial inequality and injustice show up in the United States in particular. I believe that to be values-based allows us to have more fruitful conversations with people of difference, which also requires us to exercise a certain cultural competency as it relates to dealing with people of difference. This work must be cross-disciplinary And it must value what we call community expertise, which are folks working on the ground at the grassroots, as equal to those of us who've been trained in certain fields and disciplines at the grass tops. It is inherently political, and as such, we must hold all of ourselves accountable for action. So one of the projects that I want to talk about takes us to St. Louis on a project called the Choteau Greenway, which was a 5-mile urban infrastructure project designed to cut through the middle of the city. St. Louis, just like Chicago, is a really deeply racially segregated city. In this case, in St. Louis, the majority of Black population lived to the north, the majority of white population lived to the south. And you'll see through the center between Forest Park and what's called the Arch Park, where Elio Saarinen Arch exists, is where the main kind of downtown is, where businesses are, where the universities are. So it becomes a great sort of spatial division between race and class in the city. The original competition wanted to see the Green Mile go from Forest Park to Arch Park. Our proposal suggested that if they were really serious about creating an equitable plan, that it had to break that east-west divide and create a leg of the Greenway that would go north-south, which incidentally connected two other really significant parts in the city, Fairgrounds and Tower Grove Park. So our proposal was rooted in this sort of loop and stitch strategy, which in the end connected 20 neighborhoods through this urban infrastructure project, and also created over 100 different experiences and places and destinations and assets that began to blur the lines between the North and the South, the Black and the white, the rich and the poor. These are some of the renderings. This was a project that included Stoss Landscape Urbanism and a number of other local and national economic and design professionals, again, working in this cross-disciplinary way, viewing this as not just a landscape project or a project about urban mobility, but also as an economic development project, as an ecological project, as a design project. One of the things that Urban American City was responsible for was thinking about, well, the client, Great Rivers Greenway, wanted it to be an equitable plan. And I'm sure you all hear that all the time. Well, what does that really mean? And what does it mean for St. Louis? Oftentimes, civic or urban infrastructure projects like this have a couple of ways that they do that. Either through how they do contracting on the construction side, making sure that women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses get part of the contracting, or on the community engagement side, making sure that during the process we engage neighbors and residents that are going to be affected by the project. We often find, our practice finds that these are insufficient at meaningfully having long-term equity in a project. Because for us, equity is a material or non-material ownership of something, whether that's land or business or processes or decision-making. So our work was aimed at filling in the gap between these two types of equitable practice. So in the end, we created a framework of 26 different ways that you could activate a more just and equitable outcome, either related to business, job, and wealth creation, quality of life for neighborhoods, identity and culture, and civic and community participation. And so some of these strategies can be activated on the Greenway itself, but some can be activated within the neighborhoods that the Greenway goes through. So for example, for quality of life in neighborhoods, we could have, more equitable practices around environmental leadership, health and wellness, and recreation that are actually on the path of the Greenway. But on lands adjacent to the Greenway, we should be looking at multimodal mobility, public safety, more affordable housing, making sure that the investment doesn't displace through gentrification, better capacity for community organizations to be a part of the development, and proactive community planning. So the little map that you see on the upper left-hand corner begins to show where the concentration of equitable practices need to be deployed to help to create a more equitable outcome. Another example is to look at the identity and culture practice related to how we can use art installation and art programming, how cultural representation shows up. So how do different populations with different identities see their culture made visible through the design of place? How do we use heritage and cultural preservation and storytelling as a part of creating and deepening power of place? So lastly, I'll leave you with an example that was highlighted, which is our work, which was done through a design studio called Pattern Justice for Just Pittsburgh. This was really exciting because have always been a fan of Christopher Alexander's pattern language, which is this exquisite and quite transformative 1970s document, which deconstructed the ways in which design intervention creates better places. And it works at this from the scale of the region to the doorknob, and imagines that you can combine a series of scalar interventions to solve for multiple problems. And so its methodology looks at identifying different issues at those scales and applying, using different principles, a number of different solutions. And there are over 250 different patterns that are created by pattern language. We wanted to take that framework and combine it with the Just City Index and suggest that it's not enough just to look at a set of issues, but we wanted to look at where conditions were inequitable, where there was disparity, where there was injustice, assign values to our aspiration, and from that create patterns that dismantle injustice. So from that, we took our 12 students to Pittsburgh, had a tour. We did this work centered on 4 different neighborhoods: a neighborhood that was economically stable, a neighborhood that was economically transitioning, a neighborhood that was economically emerging, meaning gentrification was starting to happen, and a neighborhood that was still deeply distressed. We talked to a number of different community members, whether it was a resident, people running nonprofits, new immigrants, business leaders, faith-based leaders as a part of our site trip. The students then came back and documented 50 different conditions of patterns of injustice across the 4 neighborhoods. Some were unique to specific neighborhoods, but some could be found in all neighborhoods. We then created this very elaborate index of the different patterns of injustice, and then each student had to create up to 5 or 6 different patterns of justice that then corresponded to a set of values that then corresponded to each of the 4 neighborhoods. So the 15 patterns of both injustice and justice are organized around these 3 themes in the space of the public, neighborhood change, and mind, body, and soul. So just a couple of examples for in the space of the public. One student noticed that there weren't a lot of spaces where neighbors could come together and just have casual interaction, that people were bringing out furniture from inside their house and just putting it on the sidewalk to engage. So this student creates a vending machine where someone can check out an inflatable set of chairs and put those in the public space in order to have engagement. The other project is because Pittsburgh has a lot of hills, it has a lot of steps that are a part of the public infrastructure, but no one was maintaining them. So this student created a series of interventions to invest in the stairs as public infrastructure. For the set of strategies related to neighborhood change, because Pittsburgh is one of those cities, like a number of your communities, that have lost a lot of population, there were a lot of vacant and abandoned schools. And so some of what was happening was that the city was selling them to private developers and they were turning them into market expensive housing. So this student suggests that you slowly deconstruct the school, always making sure that some portion of the school remains for public use by the public. And then this intervention, which was related to mind, body, and soul, was really about how do we preserve culture and identity of place. And so there was a lot of what we call cultural erasure in some of the neighborhoods where new investment was coming in and wiping out the history of neighborhood. So this project, which responds to this notion of whitewashing a neighborhood's history away, creates this urban memory bank where residents are able to create these oral histories. And then there are these installations put in public space where you can actually hear the history of the neighborhood or see the history of the neighborhood distributed throughout. So a lot of what I've just talked about is available on either of our websites, designforthejustcity.org. All of the publications that we reference are available for free download and any of the engagement tools. And then on my practice, Urban American City. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Toni. Thank you for a great introduction. I think it was very comprehensive and very, let's say, complex. And I very much like that you also started from these big ideas and you show the case studies that are really very well illustrating what you are in terms of architecture and urban planning design actually are trying to achieve. So my maybe first question, actually before I will start to put my first question, I would like to remind our audience again that they can use the slido.com hashtag Campuj online to send us their questions as well. So because this is just to be just and participatory, right? So, and my first question will be exactly connected to that, because many of these communities that are, let's say, underserved, it might be a little bit difficult to connect to them, no? To start the conversation. Especially the people coming from academia or students or politicians, they're a little bit, let's say, there's some suspicion, no, maybe, or some maybe little bit distance or gap. So what kind of tools of engagement of the public or in the neighborhoods you are using, or what kind of strategies or how you make them involved?
Yeah, I think it varies, and it really depends on a couple of things. If you have a neighborhood or community that already has a robust practice of engaging with one another, you might be able to start with a conversation about values, right? Because they're used to coming together and engage. And while the values can sometimes be a little bit abstract, I often find it's interesting for people to do their visioning first, to imagine, what is the aspiration for what I have rather than starting with the problem. But if you have a community or a group that hasn't, ever gotten together before and doesn't have a culture of engagement, it hasn't practiced what it means to come together and talk together, the first time you do that, they're likely going to want to talk about, well, what's wrong? Right? And so maybe that's where you have to start. Maybe you have to start with a conversation that names what are the conditions that have been unjust and unfair to us. And once you air that, it's like airing your grievances, then you can come back and say, okay, now let's imagine what our future can be, right? Yeah. And then the next step for both of those is then, okay, how do we then come together to solve those problems? So some of the tools that we've put on the Just City Lab website allows a community to start in either of those places, whether you start with the values, or there's another tool we have that allows you to start to name and map, take a map and name where things are not working well, and then come back and aspire for the future.
Is your experience that, for example, let's say conversation works really well because it's the question of the language as well. It's when you are speaking about using the maps, of course, I find a lot of difficulties with people with the ability to read any maps. So that's also my kind of question: if there is you have some special tools, you know, how to open up this conversation, or maybe through some walks through the neighborhood, or just because the locals are definitely the best experts on their own neighborhood, right? So if you want to find the broken stairs, probably they will show you, no, in a way, no?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's fantastic that we all walk around with these little computers in our pocket, or at least most of us do, and that we have the ability to share information from them. So, you know, we have an Instagram account called #JustCityOrNot. And in one of the classes I taught, one of the things that I had students do for about 3 or 4 weeks is just walk around and take photographs of things that they thought were just or unjust. Perfect. And then we bring those to class and talk about them. So, you know, in advance of having meetings or engagements with members of your community, one of the things you might ask them to do is bring in their own photographs of what's working or what's not working, or take a picture of something that you think is a representation of acceptance, or something you think is a representation of power, something you think is a representation of inclusion. And then you can use everyone's photographs, right? And then they have to tell you, well, where did you take it? Then you can put that on the map as a way of getting people to begin understanding how to read maps. So the power of photography, and again, walking around with the ability to do that, can be a really powerful tool to engage a wide range of people in conversations about place.
Right. And you actually mentioned that you are working with kids. It means you are also using the, let's say, infrastructure of the educational system of the schools. For example, when you are approaching the communities, you also work a lot with the youth, or is it one of the, let's say, age groups that is more open to conversation, or you have different strategies for different age groups?
Yeah, well, as I've been talking about students, I've really been talking about the graduate students at the GSD.
Okay.
Although we have had some of our research assistants do this with younger students. They've done the exercise. And we're actually about to hopefully initiate a collaboration with a charter school here in New York called Bronx Charter School for the Arts, which is a program from kindergarten to 6th grade. And during COVID, they actually used the Just City Index and asked their students to create artworks inspired by some of their values. We're now in conversation with them to think about how we might build a Just City curriculum that figures out how to embed this question into the different curriculum that they have related to the arts. And they have everything from performing arts to visual arts. So we're really excited to begin to see how we might pilot this for younger students. But most of my work, obviously, is dealing with graduate students at the Graduate School of Design.
You also mentioned in the talks that we are usually using kind of a tactical approach today to tackle these diverse issues connected with the inequality. I've noticed a kind of a major shift in the last decades from the tendency to try to mix the diverse social groups in the city, like physically, put, for example, the social housing in the middle of the let's say, higher income neighborhood or something like that, because it actually prove that it's much more complicated and it's not really solving the problem in a way. And so do you find that let's say, this tactical approach is, let's say, it's more acupuncture kind of approach, maybe it's more long-term, but it might be more successful, but in the same time, it's not actually, do you feel it's like more bottom-up in this time, or is it more the work with the community is much closer, is much more, the approach is much more individual, and that's why it might be more successful than it used to be maybe 30 years ago, when there were these big projects to bring all these communities to resettle them, or to bring to build a completely new social housing project for them, or something like that?
Well, you know, in our country, and you may have the same condition, there are these long-standing and chronic concentrations of poverty. that have extended multiple generations. And I think there's been ample research to show the ways in which people don't thrive in those environments when there is a constant, deep and longstanding concentration of poverty. And so I think it's still very important, and I think there's still ways in which designers and public officials are looking for ways to figure out the benefits of mixed income communities. I think what's important to that is making sure that wealth and ownership is distributed across multiple income brackets. It's not just the wealthy owning, but middle and working class families are owning, and lower income people are sort of on the pathway to ownership. So I think the notion of mixed income communities is still an important one. I do, however, and this is something that's coming up in conversations around gentrification, and actually something that showed up when we were doing research around social justice in public space. Just because you put people proximate together doesn't mean they socially interact. And so the value of connectivity is not only related to mobility, it's also related to social interaction. And we've seen that when you mix people together of different incomes or even races, it doesn't necessarily mean that they form social ties or networks that are mutually beneficial. So the things that we do to activate or reactivate social connectivity is just as important as the ways with which we mix land uses together that put people next to each other. But the real challenge is to figure out how people interact with one another.
I've just noticed, for example, in the city of London, they are trying to push the investors to dedicate at least 20% of the housing stock, of the newly built housing stock, to the, let's say, social or, let's say, affordable housing. No? And because they say it's very important to do it on the spot, on the place, in the place. That's exactly, actually, a little bit opposing to what you say. Of course,
no, that's not opposing at all. That's a great example of what I was just talking about.
Yeah, and it's that actually it's the strategy you say is to increase the mobility is actually creating quite similar effect, no, in a way to bring people together. Yeah. I found some questions here already from our audience. So there is one question: do you think the different communities, like of different ethnicities, like Afro-American, Asian American, Latino, are using the space differently? And do you take into consideration different public space design for these, for example, different communities of different ethnicities?
Yes, that's a really great question. And in fact, the study we did with Jan Gehl around public life and urban justice and public space is one of the ways in which we looked at that really explicitly. And so that is a study that developed a number of different metrics to evaluate how people's identities showed up. And one of the sort of metrics we looked at was one around this notion of social connectivity. And so we did a survey that asked people, since the space has been developed, and these are public plazas, which have been designed in different communities. And we asked people, since the space has been redesigned, one, do you recognize people more that are of your neighborhood? But then secondly, have you made any new friends? And then have you made any new friends or acquaintances of people who are different from you? So it's not enough just to be in the same space together. Like, how do people really form bonds and relationships? The other question was around the metric of inclusion. And some of the ways in which we were looking to see how inclusion showed up in public space was looking at programming. So we did an inventory of the ways in which the different communities had programming in the different public plazas. And what we found, and we wanted to know who was programming. So plazas that included Tai Chi, African drumming, yoga, chess, right, was an indication of, were you programming the space with different activities that actually were ethnically and culturally specific as a way of inviting different populations of difference together versus some plazas that maybe were only being programmed with a singular type of programming. So that was a way of acknowledging that, yes, in fact, different ethnic groups do have things that are really culturally specific, and that public space is an opportunity to invite all of those different types of things to be accessible, not just to that ethnic group, but to everyone as a way of learning more tolerance for different sort of cultural activities and people.
So at the end, it's more important not to design as public space for one specific ethnic group, but make it open enough so that people could actually meet as well the others, yeah. Right?
And we actually did look at the way the plazas were designed. And through the program, most of them are designed to not have a lot of fixed elements, but elements that are movable. In that way, you actually allow and invite neighbors to come and configure the space in different ways to accommodate different types of programming. So that's something that is actually in the designer's control. The proportion of hard space to soft space, the distribution of fixed elements versus things that are movable, where you put fixed planters and landscape features versus parts of the space that are open that allow for you to configure them in different ways. So this is a great example of where the designer actually does really have an important role to play in looking to address those issues of connectivity, accessibility, inclusion.
I can also imagine that it might be very important for the local policymakers to have a voice like you are providing with your advocacy and with your design practice. Is it often or is it usual that actually the municipality is approaching you? Is it the first, let's say, invitation is coming from the side of the, let's say, political representation, or who is who's making the first step?
It's been mixed. In the Detroit work, it was a combination of philanthropy, which I know works very differently here than in Europe, and the mayor of the city. In my work in Milwaukee, it was actually the business community that approached me first. In St. Louis, it was a municipal regional park agency. And so it's been really different in different cities. In Chicago, it was a community nonprofit organization. But I will say, you know, who initially reaches out to me, what I usually like to do is I don't like there to be a single client. So even though the business community may do the first outreach, when we design the project, I like for the client group to be community plus business plus government, or community plus philanthropy plus government. It's really important, as I was talking about, to create that cross-sectoral table, because all of those sectors ultimately, depending on, and I work on, you know, kind of comprehensive scale projects, meaning all of those different sectors have to play some role in the implementation. So I've been approached by all of those different types of clients, but ultimately we set the table to include all of those different actors.
Okay. And are some of these projects like pure research projects, or most of them are actually oriented towards the realization? So it means when this client approaches you, is it important for you that he also brings the investment in it afterwards so that it gets realized, or how you look at it?
Well, in my practice, Urban American City, right? So those are all that's my consultant practice. So those are all projects where the client group is looking to actually make change. And so to the extent that part of the planning work is to actually not only figure out the idea or the solution, but to actually figure out how the solution can be implemented. So yes, we're talking about, you know, how to access resources, how to use resources that exist, how to find additional resources as a part of the project. And then there's some projects like the the urban life public justice study we've done for public space, that was more of a research project. We did that on behalf of the city's Department of Transportation, but it was to build an evaluation tool for that client to use to evaluate future investments related to public plazas. So on the research lab does research-oriented projects, and then my consultant practice does projects that we're hoping to push into implementation.
So are there already some of your projects already put into the reality, or you have already some feedback from the users when some of these, let's say, interventions were realized, or it's not, they're not yet? I know it's pretty short time for urban planning, right? Because in urban planning everything is so slow, you know. But
well, when I was a lot of the plans we did when I was deputy planning director in Washington D.C., a lot of those neighborhoods and those projects are actually in the ground. They're buildings and things and public spaces that show up. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud about is the Anacostia waterfront, where a lot of the waterfront was cut off from public use because there was industry on it. What I'm happy to say now is that a good majority of the waterfront is now accessible to the public by the creation of new park space that didn't exist before. So that's one outcome that I think is really exciting. So a lot of the work I did when I was in the public sector in DC is beginning to be realized. The work in Detroit is also slowly coming underway. I mean, that was a plan for the entire city, so it's going to take decades for that to work. But there definitely have been investments happening in neighborhoods and in the downtown that are coming to realization as a result of that 3-year planning effort. And the Choteau Greenway, which was the project that I showed in St. Louis, they're actually starting the planning and design work for the first phase of the Greenway.
Yeah. I have here actually a very nice question from the audience again. It's a nice but very difficult question. What do you feel are the biggest obstacles keeping us from getting to the state of a just city immediately?
I don't think the arc of justice is an immediate one. As Martin Luther King used to say, the arc towards justice is long. But I do feel like there are things and opportunities that are probably before us today to start moving the needle on that. And this is where I think, it's important for everybody to drill down and look very critically at what's before them as a priority. How to align with different sectors of your community to mobilize to do that. I think, people way younger than me and the activism that we've seen over the last year by young people has created an extraordinary momentum that's forcing us into action in ways that we hadn't before. So I think it's important for your community to grab one of those moments and one of those issues and start to do work on them. And I think we can do that at so many different scales, whether it's on our own block, in our own neighborhood, through our own practice. I have colleagues that during the height of the pandemic and after the uprisings from the murder of George Floyd, who donated pro bono work to communities to help them address some critical need that was before them. So I think there are many, many ways, even if it's a small gesture or slice of your time or investment, that can start to make differences. And that's what I would look for.
Yeah. I have another question here from Rosalie. The so-called no-go zones are often spoken about in media. As for you, how big of an issue is it? Or is it more a bias? In any case, what can we do about it, about no-go zones?
What's a no-go zone? I'm sorry.
I can imagine it's a zone where where the locals tell you don't go there. I mean.
Yeah. You mean like that's a place where you shouldn't invest in, or an unsafe neighborhood? I'm not
maybe
sure.
Unsafe neighborhood, I would say. No, or maybe that's a good question. Yeah, I don't. Maybe you are right, because you can understand it in very different ways. are there any no-go zones in fact, or is it just a way how you look at it? Actually, it's just, let's say, what for someone could be a no-go zone, for someone else could be maybe a great opportunity, or maybe it's a matter of the perspective.
Well, I mean, it's a little difficult question because I don't know the context, but I would say I generally try to practice and set a table for conversation that are not binaries of either or, but try to find where there could potentially be the both and. Meaning, you know, the work we have to do for those of us who are committed to, you know, broadening the table of participants and decision-making in more democratic ways. The idea is to move away from the notion of there's a winner and a loser to the notion of can everyone at the table walk away with something? It may not be the thing that you thought when you got to the table. It may not be the same thing as someone else, but we should be able to find a multiplicity of outcomes that address, I think, the complexity of urban issues that we've been talking about this afternoon. And so, you know, if I find that when I start with that is where I want to end up, it allows me to try to facilitate ways in which we don't get to the go, no go kind of conversation, but that we can find the ways that there can be multiple solutions to multiple problems. I hope that begins to answer the question a little bit. And I have to say, I have, I think, room, time for maybe one more question before.
Yeah, okay, so it seems like you are really, let's say, stretching the borders of the design profession, no, in your practice. What do you think is what kind of expertise or what kind of interdisciplinary experts are very important for you to collaborate with on a daily basis, let's say, outside of the design world?
Yeah, well, you know, it's why I wanted to start this talk this evening with my journey, because, you know, I was a hardcore architect. I wanted to be an architect when I was 14 years old. And I really enjoyed being an architect and designing buildings. And even when I was a city official, my role was to be an arbiter of good design and help to raise the value of design excellence in cities. But, you know, it was very hard to look away from the way in which capital markets and investment in deep division across our city was affecting what we designed, where we designed, and how we designed. And I just thought that that was not right. And so as I began to learn more about the history of development of our cities, understand the role of public policy, I now practice design alongside economists, real estate developers, sociologists, geographers, artists, industrial designers, graphic designers, people in philanthropy, people in capital markets, elected officials, neighborhood residents, nonprofits. Depending on what I'm doing, some combination of all of those folks need to be nested around me or within my team if the work we do as designers is to have a different or expanded impact, which I believe in a lot of cases it can, whether it's the building design to be more inclusive and welcoming and inviting to people of difference, whether it's the distribution of civic infrastructure in ways that are fair and equitable and just, or the way neighborhoods are designed and who is designing and building our spaces. So this was a journey for me. I did not know that this was going to be the path or set of issues that would move me to, I think, the career I've been able to design. But I'm so thankful that the journey has allowed me to expand not only my approach, but to, in my role as professor of practice, begin to shape young professionals to begin to think in this more integrated way about design. We have a number of our students getting dual degrees in public health and public policy, divinity school, education, and hopefully, as this talk maybe is illuminating, share some of what we're doing in the academy and my practice such that others may take it and continue to evolve and develop it and use it. So thank you again for allowing me to spend a little time with you and your community this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Toni, very much for our discussion and for being with us. You really expanded our understanding now of the architecture profession. So thank you. And I would like to also invite our audience shortly to our next urban talk that will be on April 20th. We will have Ed Glazer, author of the book Triumph of the City, and follow us on social networks and on our blog campui.online. Thank you, Toni, and have a good evening.
And please let me know the results of your poll. I want to know what the
Right, I can tell you that to you right now. 57% engagement. Engagement is the top, and acceptance is 43%. Number 2. Engagement and acceptance. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Toni, for being with us.
My pleasure. Have a good evening.